We're very, very excited to welcome Lauren Meranda. Not only is she an educator and a founder of a design studio, she's also one of the brains behind the Chicago Graphic Design Club. So super excited to hear her talk today. So with that said, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and the floor is yours, Lauren.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Be able to hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, hello. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Lauren Meranda, and I am the founder and lead designer at Studio Brazen, and I'm also an assistant professor of design at Northeastern Illinois University. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous people who have stewarded the land that we occupy in the United States. This land acknowledgement was developed with Tiff Beatty of the National Public Housing Museum. Although we come to this virtual event from many different places, Studio Brazen, um, the um, Studio Brazen, the National Public Housing Museum, and the Chicago Graphic Design Club reside within the traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi people. Acknowledging this history is particularly relevant given today's topic and the mission of the National Public Housing Museum to address the long history of displacement and forced migration, which is a narrative that links Indigenous people to public housing residents, to Black people, and to low-income residents in search of affordable housing throughout the country. From settler colonialism to modern day gentrification, the practice of white supremacy and the rampant unchecked system of capitalism have terrorized people throughout the history of the United States. At the same time, there have been brave, fierce, and Indigenous organizers, activists, and advocates who have unleashed their radical imaginations to work against injustice and to find creative solutions for healing and reconciliation, recognizing that to free the people, we must also free the land. Before we dive into any specific projects, I'd like to take a step back and set the scene a little bit. What is a monument? In one of the quintessential resources on monuments, the author writes, in the oldest and most original sense, a monument is a work of man erected for the specific purpose of keeping particular human deeds or destinies alive and present in the consciousness of future generations. All right, so for me, that raises some red flags, like who gets to decide which particular human deeds or destinies get to be kept alive? Because you all know someone is making those decisions. This idea that official public narratives are being curated and solidified in stone is one reason why monuments are having a moment right now. This has been a conversation for many years, but has really been thrust into the foreground recently with the rise of protests throughout the United States, showing outrage over the monumentalization of Confederate soldiers. And people are tired of our history being presented in a way that pacifies reality, that keeps us from learning and growing. I began this research in 2012 while working on my Master of Design at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I looked into monuments, memorials, and the design of public memory. Monuments and memorials are recognizable terms, but what is public memory? As individuals, we partake in memory in a number of ways. There's social memory, which comes from when a group of people somehow related to one another recollect what has happened to the group as a whole. The mood and tone asserted in this setting informs the individual's perception of the event or events. Further removed from social memory is collective memory. In the case of traumatic events, collective memory occurs when many individuals have their own distinct memories of a shared event. For example, nearly everyone in the United States remembers where they were when they heard the news of September 11th. I know I was in class, I was in high school when the principal came over the intercom to tell us that two planes had flown into the World Trade Center. And I won't forget it. He said, "It did not appear to be an accident." Um, my memory is unique to my experience and not dependent on others' memories of the same event. Public memory, on the other hand, takes place out in the open where discussion with others is necessary for formation. Museums, monuments, and memorials are public places where private acts of commemoration lead to the emergence of public memory. Public memory eventually becomes accepted as truth and lays a foundation for public discourse and action. Our public memory impacts our perception of events and real people. It affects our systems and public policies. We can see all of this playing out in real time as we have a national and local debate about what to do with our public monuments to Confederate soldiers. The city of Chicago has developed a Chicago Monuments Project with a committee looking into various options. This is something folks in Chicago have been asking for. Students in North Lawndale questioned the name of Douglas Park that was originally named after a slave-owning former Senator Stephen Douglas. And by adding an extra S to the end, they changed the memorial to remember Frederick Douglass, as well as his wife, Anna Murray Douglas, who helped her husband escape slavery. Public memory is developed through cultural understanding, which is why museums, monuments, and memorials are vital for the future. I just happened upon this field right after college. I started working as a graphic designer and then an exhibition designer at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum in Chicago. It was at Hull House where I began to question my role as a designer and the representation of history and public memory. Because of this job, I decided to go to grad school at UIC. When it was time to decide on a thesis topic, I was originally interested in pursuing these ideas surrounding the design of public memory through the lens of museum exhibitions. It was also around that time that my alma mater, Northern Illinois University, announced that they were renovating and reopening Cole Hall. For anyone unfamiliar with the significance of that, on February 14th, 2008, a former student walked into a lecture hall and opened fire, killing 5 and wounding over 30. They were reopening Cole Hall and memorializing the tragedy with this. 5 granite slabs engraved "Forward, Together, Forward." Together Forward, which is a together forward more than the school's fight song, in case you weren't aware. Oh yeah, and you can kind of see the names of the 5 students who died that day, small and atrociously typeset towards the bottom of the stones. Truthfully, I'm more bothered by it now after having looked at and talked about it for the past 10 years. All I knew then was that these memorials were much more significant to me. These memorials offered solace to a scared and confused campus. They brought healing to a hurting community, and they really spoke to me. You can see me in the middle photo in the green jacket. Collective negative events often invoke within an individual a natural desire to memorialize. Whether in the stone memorials at the National Mall, posters designed for the tsunami in Japan, or ghost bikes and roadside memorials filled with teddy bears and handmade cards, there is a presence of creation and creative expression following tragedies. From these examples and many more, I found the motives of memorialization could be split into 2 categories: the psychology of loss and the creation of public memory. Which leads me to the question, who decides what we are to remember? And more importantly, who decides that which we are to forget? As designers, we have a social responsibility to respect and represent the people served by our work. In memorials stemming from collective tragedy, design should seek to facilitate the grieving process and allow the public memory to come from those who the monument affects. How can one public story capture the entirety of a moment? Well, perhaps a single story should not be the only one we tell. I wanted to put that notion into action, and so I decided to design my own memorial for NIU. I started by taking inventory and making lists. I came up with a collection of descriptive words to better understand both official and vernacular memorials. And then I compared the lists. What were the strengths of each? Where did they overlap? From this, a new list emerged, a list of goals, a design brief. I set out to make a memorial representing multiple first-person voices, a memorial not confined to permanence or place, one that was thoughtfully designed and most importantly was a cathartic space for collective grieving. Next, I asked questions and did many experiments. How do I tell many stories at once? Can I layer stories as text? Can stories be pulled together to generate a composite story? Can the stories be introduced over time through motion graphics, or can I collect the stories through forms? At first, I decided to collect stories via email or on Facebook. I also, because of the time that it was done, I set up a Tumblr page for people to call in, or a hotline for people to call in and record their oral stories, and people responded. I gathered those stories and entered them into a database. I did some material studies and experiments with projections, and the physical memorial began to take form. Sheer sheets stretched from wall to wall, covering a room in a shroud of stories suspended in space. The properties of light and sheer screens evoke a spirit of solemnity and catharsis, a safe space to face a difficult subject, in which the viewer can simultaneously see the individual and the collective at work. Each story flows from an individual's memory, but it also becomes a part of ours as well. This collective begins to take a readable form, creating not only a public record, but a pulpit, shining light on greater issues of gun violence and control through the lens of human experience. For the voice of the memorial, it was not a curatorial voice nor a historian's, but rather it resounded directly from the people who experienced history that day. This is key. As the saying goes, nothing for us without us. Monuments come from within. Traditionally, we expect monuments and memorials to be erected under certain circumstances, when a collective tragedy occurs and there has been loss of life. After a notable person passes, we often build monuments in their honor. Significant cultural occurrences have also been the inspiration for monumentalization, such as the Gateway Arch in St. Louis for westward expansion of the United States, which I hope makes us question the power a monument has in shaping public memory of the past, because westward expansion came at a great expense. So what should we be memorializing? I'm actually not going to answer that question directly, because I'm not the authority on all things, which one would have to be in order to make that call. But if the goals of a monument are, as I've concluded, to aid in the grieving process and to establish a collective public memory, then the question should be, how should we memorialize? Monuments and memorials can be observed as an important feature in the formation of public memory and national identity. In increasingly individualized cultures, there have been a rise in the mistrust of official history. This mistrust has brought greater attention and reverence to the means by which public memories are formed. At a very basic level, humanity is wired for community. Even as independent individuals, we rely on the collectivity of community for survival. Relying on others for survival has developed a desire to connect with those we rely on and have relied on. This combines with our desire to be understood and not forgotten. In a prescriptive effort to have our own stories heard, we attempt to hear the stories of the past. Museums attach us to history through collecting, curating, and displaying objects. Monuments and memorials develop public memories of our past in the open, in front of and with others. In 2016, I started working on an ephemeral monument in Stubbarfjordur, which is a small town in eastern Iceland. This town used to be a thriving fishing town with almost 1,000 residents until about 10 years ago, when a large fishing company bought the town's factory, shut it down, and then used their national fishing quota somewhere else. This left most of the townspeople out of work and was devastating for the local economy. In a few years' time, the population was down to under 300 people. I traveled to Iceland for 2 months to learn from the community and work with the townspeople to develop a monument for the loss of the fishing industry. A different kind of monument, not for the loss of life, but for the loss of a livelihood. I ate meals with my neighbors. They showed me how to fish in the fjord, and I documented everything. After a while, I began to see the fjord as another world, as another character in the narrative. I hooked up a 360 camera to a fishing pole and explored the depth and life of the water, showing that there is still beauty under the surface. I then used A-Frame to create VR underwater experiences for the townspeople. We brought in VR headsets and hung them from the ceiling of inside the old fish factory building. Residents of the town were then able to visit and experience the underwater scenes and hopefully find peace and comfort in the beauty. That was my second attempt at a different kind of monument, one that was about the present as much as the past, one that was more democratic, that continues to grow, expand, and move around. A different kind of monument that is ephemeral by nature and demonstrates power by making a mark in a public space. Not all cultures possess a congruous narrative of their origins. For example, the relationship among place, history, and community holds a much different ethos within the context of Romani collective memory. The fluidity of culture and of oral storytelling creates an ever-evolving history that reflects fixed experiences of past times. The Romani possess their distinctive histories and memories because they forget and therefore continually reinvent them, not because they remember the past in a canonical or uniform sense. There is no history. It dissolves the permanent present their transience relies on. This phenomena is not the case for most cultures. Individuals, as well as publics, derive their sense of identity by attempting to remember with continuity. How memories are erased, forgotten, or willed absent has come to be seen as equally important to the ways in which memories are set in place. Monuments and memorials serve the function of housing and recounting public memories that are forgotten in our everyday lives. Forgetting is an important force alongside memory and history in shaping our understanding of the past. Authors or designers of public monuments are entrusted with the power to direct public memory by their curation of what is to be remembered and what is to be willed absent or forgotten. This task holds great responsibility and the potential for grave ramifications. Right after I returned from Iceland, I began working with the National Public Housing Museum in 2016. Formally organized in 2007 as a cultural initiative dedicated to advancing the belief that housing is a human right, the National Public Housing Museum was founded by current and former residents as a way to challenge the existing narrative around public housing. The existing narrative around public housing is rough at best. Growing up here in Chicago, I heard the media spread horrific and one-sided stories of blight and violence at housing complexes like Capri Green. We didn't get the stories of community care and resilience, or the full story of how we as a society failed those in public housing. That part of the story was willed absent. And the National Public Housing Museum has been working to right that wrong and telling a more full and nuanced account. Last year, after a long battle, The NPHM acquired the last remaining building of the former Jane Addams homes at Taylor and Ada and broke ground on demo earlier in the year. No electricity, no running water. That is, unless you count the massive amount of water leaking in from the roof. But the site is kind of a mess, but it is also a bit of a treasure trove. I go there occasionally to get a better sense of the space, and every time I find something interesting. All of this leads to the development of a monument series for the residents of public housing. For this project, we looked at the idea of the building itself as a monument, the former Jane Addams homes, and the future site of NPHM, which is just sitting still while the renovation is being planned. The building itself is a monument, but monuments can fall silent if not kept alive through ritual, public use, and or protest. We wanted to activate the site through artistic intervention and bring consciousness to that which many see as unmonumental. For this monument, that being everyday living inside of public housing. Which brings us to At Home, Ephemeral Monuments to Public Housing Residents. It's important to remember that public housing is home. Home can mean many things to many people. It's a place where you rest your head, the table where you eat family meals. It's the place where we experience both pain and joyous celebration. These memories are the ordinary, everyday activities that make up life at home. These memories are valuable and important. At Home is a series of projection installations which act as ephemeral monuments to the everyday lives and stories of public housing residents. The projections began in Chicago, the future site of the National Public Housing Museum, but is intended to travel all over the country at sites of significance to those who have lived in public housing. Short 3-sentence stories will continue to be collected and added to an online database. Visitors to the website can see documentation of the project installations or take a look at the collection of narratives as text. The concept expanded from there. We put out a call for residents past and present to tell us stories about life at home. We wanted to let the residents' voices tell their stories, so we organized writing workshops where residents could come and write 3 to 5 sentence stories. So we planned that, but then March 2020 happened and there was no way we could gather folks together for in-person workshops. And we wanted to be mindful of access to technology for anything virtual. For many years though, residents and museum workers have been collecting audio recordings of resident stories, capturing a sonic soundscape of life in public housing. As we were finding objects around the future site, we began making connections between some of the stories and the things we were finding. We learned that the toxic green paint we found was known as CHA green and was standard in all Chicago Housing Authority buildings. Many residents had a lot to say about that green paint. The lovely woman in the image on the left is oral historian and former resident of Henry Horner Homes here in Chicago, Shakira Johnson. Shakira was instrumental in this project. She went through the museum's collection of oral stories, many of which she performed, and took inventory of all the stories relating to life at home in Chicago public housing. We then had the stories transcribed so that we could animate the text for the installation. Over the summer, trusted friend and Studio Brazen collaborator, Andrea Chavez, and I took scans of the wall we are planning to use and did test projections to understand some of the limitations of the space and medium. We had to develop an aesthetic that worked with those limitations, right? So there are these windows that were boarded up and painted orange. There was also really strange environmental lighting. So half of the wall was brighter than the other half. And that really changed what we could do in that space. So it had to be white text. We tried some orange text to match the windows, but orange on the wall was not visible at all. Any color really on the wall was not visible at all. I mean, you could see it, but you could not make out words. So we stuck to white text and then used orange for accents. The text movement was correlated to the content and paced with speech patterns so that when somebody is standing there reading it, they can start to imagine it in their mind and hear somebody speaking it. The different animations were produced by a number of folks. So it was worked on by Andre Chavez, Alicia Barnaby, and Eric Cruz, in addition to myself. The logo was designed by Rudar Manning, and it conveys the idea of home without defining the form that that a home could take. It also is related to the NPHM logo, which uses a door. And I then animated the logo so that it can be used in the projection installation. Of course, there were some challenges because, well, of course, the week before the display, the museum director, Lisa Lee, found that the wall we decided to use had taken scans of, done tests on, already started making animations for, had been vandalized. Quite impressively, I will admit. And the message is quite legitimate, you know, like stop the evictions right there. But it wasn't going to work when we're putting more text over it in the projections, so it had to be removed. That proved to be more difficult than I would have imagined. We contacted the alderman's office and were told that since it wasn't profane, then it wasn't a priority. So we just were put to the end of the list. I ended up texting my uncle, who's a local contractor, to see if he knew of like a company we could hire that could remove the graffiti. And to this day, I don't know what went down exactly, but a few hours later, I get a text from him that the city graffiti busters were on their way to the building. It was all very Chicago. Yeah, it was it was great. In the end, we got most of the graffiti removed. They couldn't get the boarded up windows because they were afraid that the force would blow them in. So was it ideal? But honestly, like I didn't mind it because this is real life and it's okay for that to show. I mean, I'm bored with like faux perfection anyway. What was left didn't interfere with the legibility of the projections, and that is what really mattered. The whole run of it is too long to play here, but I wanted to share a few of the stories with you all. The full video is up on the website at homemonument.org. But for now, I'll just play a few for you. All right, so that was only 3 of the stories. There's many more. Again, you can watch the full video at athomemonument.org. Um, we arranged a socially distanced private viewing of the monument for the residents whose stories were featured before the opening of the monument to the public. A goal throughout the project was to empower residents through storytelling. Each story is in the words of a resident, not a curator, and consent and collaboration was a crucial part of the process, which is why we wanted to be sure to include the folks whose stories were being presented, that they approved of how we represented their words and memories. We interviewed a few folks about their reactions to seeing their stories large scale and on the side of the building. Their responses were powerful and insightful. Over the next year, we are working to develop further iterations of At Home to be displayed at other sites of significance for public housing residents across the country, letting the official public memory arise from those who were impacted most. So as I wrap up, I want to play some of those reactions that we recorded. The first one is from Francine Washington, followed by H. Bonner Demetrius, and then we will close with Reverend Hatch, whose sister Rhoda's story was featured in the monument.
There's no sound, Lauren.
Does that mean there was no sound that entire time?
I mean, we
Y'all just
you talk, but
okay, let's see. Let me, okay, I click share sound. This works.
no.
Okay, well, these videos are also up on, I could, Christian, if I send you the link, would you be able to share your screen for just this slide? Because it's the last one.
Sure.
All right, I will put it to just you in the chat.
I'm requesting access. There you go.
Oh, goodness gracious. Sorry, y'all. This is so unprofessional. Okay, let's just not play the videos because we don't have a ton of time left anyway. You can watch the, it's only 8-minute, but that's also on the website. So you can go to athomemonument.org and watch it there. So, yeah, that's that is the project. We will be doing more iterations of it, like I've said. So please follow athomemonument.org, and also me, my personal, like I only have Instagram, so sorry y'all, but you can't just follow me on anything. But I'm at Lauren Meranda for my personal, and then my studio is at That's So Brazen. So that is everything minus the videos.
That was great, Lauren. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I'm very curious about whether you could just quickly summarize some of those reactions from the residents seeing their stories on the wall, because I can't imagine seeing your written work projected on something so large.
It was really, really quite moving. So I will, hopefully you can at least see his face. All right, so this is Reverend Marshall Elijah Hatch. I've paused it on a really unfortunate place. Okay, so Reverend Hatch's sister Rhoda's story was featured in the monument, and Rhoda had actually passed away over the summer from COVID, and so their whole family came to the monument, because we had been talking with Rhoda earlier in the summer, got approval to use her story, and then she had passed away, and their whole family came, and it was like a memorial service for them because they weren't able to have a funeral. And actually, like, there was a documentary film crew from Al Jazeera that was following Reverend Hatch has kind of a famous church in Chicago, or famous kind of like congregation that he leads. And so, or well known, I don't know if famous is the right word, but like a well-known congregation. And so like Al Jazeera came and was following around the family, talking about how the pandemic has in fact affected communities of color. And it was really just like an impactful moment to hear how they were seeing the words of their sister, who was no longer with that, like with us, immortalized on the building, right? They were able to kind of have her, he talks about how they were able to have her with them for just another moment. So it was really a moving interview. And the thing is, I actually wasn't there for the interviews, because I was like manning the monument. So I edited the videos afterwards, and I was just like in tears, sobbing, listening to the stories, and people talking about how Francine Washington, who we saw we saw her story about the paint, about painting the wall, was talking about how she never felt like her stories were worth sharing. Like they were not, that they weren't as like they were never presented that way. They never, she's never seen them big and her words big and on like on a wall in that way. And that it felt really gratifying and satisfying to be able to see that.
And then I have another question. And then, by the way, if anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to drop them in the chat or use the raised hand reaction, and then I'll call your name. But the other question that comes to mind is like, how many, like how large was the creative team on this? Because it seems like there was a lot of work that went.
Yeah. So I this was kind of like an idea. Obviously, it was like an extension of my work within monuments and memorials that I've been doing for many years. So I presented this idea to Lisa Lee, who is the director of the National Public Housing Museum, in probably like fall of 2018. And then we applied for some grants to get funding, finally got a grant, and was able to build the team. I first started with just Shakira and Andres, and then had to grow the design team minimally because we had so many stories to animate and so much time, and it actually takes a really long time to do some of those text animations. So part of it was creating, so I created a system, and then those designers were able to use the system to create graphics that were within the brand of it. And then on the museum side, the museum is such a small group of staff as well. Lisa Lee is the director, and then there's Tafedi, who's does like programming, and Mark Jeske and Shakira Johnson were the folks on the museum side who worked on this.
Cool. Alyssa, I see you have your hand raised, so I'm gonna ask you to unmute, and then you could ask your question.
Sorry. Oh my god, I put that in the chat. Going
back
back
Hi,
to hey prof. I'm trying to go back to the chat. Oh my god, I use Teams for work, so this is foreign for me. Okay. So besides the graffiti happening right before you were supposed to do the display, what were some of your biggest obstacles for this memorial? Or maybe a better term would be design challenges.
So there were lots of challenges. I think the graffiti one was funny and it was resolved, so it was like fine to share. It's part of the reason. But I think the biggest one was that we couldn't have the writing workshops, which was really instrumental. Like that was so important to me that we got to interact like with the residents. That I didn't want it to have any semblance of me being the voice of it, that I was curating anything. I wanted the ideas and like to really work with the residents so that it was their monument. And not being able to do that was really hard, but it also opened up different paths, and it allowed for Shakira to really step up and take on the like gathering of stories. And for me that was perfect because Shakira is a resident, or was a resident of Henry Horner Homes, and already had done so many interviews with so many people. And so that challenge like felt bad at the time. It felt really big. It felt like, okay, how can we even do this? But it turned out to be a really good thing, because it brought Shakira in more. Yeah, I think that was one of the bigger challenges that we faced. And also when, we'd been working on it for over a year, and that's when kind of the big movement surrounding monuments started happening, where we were having protests, we were having people like tearing down monuments, um, like a guerrilla style, which was awesome to see. But it meant that there was like a resurgence of lots of monuments and monument talks that were happening, and like scholarship around monuments. And we had originally had the start date for the monument, um, and then the Chicago Humanities Festival planned a talk about monuments and memorials on the same day. So we're like, oh, great. We have to definitely push this back because the Chicago Humanities Festival is huge. Like, they're getting all the people. Like, we got to defer to them. But that also turned out well because if anybody doesn't know who Lisa Lee is, she's like this amazing cultural influence in just art, and she's amazing. I just cannot speak highly enough of Lisa Lee. But she also is really connected to like Chicago Humanities Festival and kind of that world. And so she was able to, whoa, my light went off too. She was able to connect with the Chicago Humanities Festival and got us a plug at the beginning of their talk for folks to check out the monument as well. So that also turned out okay. I guess challenges are just opportunities to kind of pivot, right?
Mhm. Someone had a question. John asks, can you speak more to your intent behind the impermanence of the memorialization in your first project? What are your thoughts on how permanent a monument should be?
So it's a good question. I don't think that like permanent monuments are terrible. I just didn't feel connected to the permanent monument that was for me. Like that monument was supposed to be for me. And it made me think about like, well, then who are these monuments for, right? Like who are, and then what is there for the people who are actually impacted by it, by any event or occurrence, right? Where are the monuments that belong to those people and aren't just for the public? Like, can we have both? And then when I heard about and like was learning and reading about the Romani cultures, about this impermanence and how we can still pass along traditions, but by allowing things to fade, then we allow them to be retold in ways that are responding to new information and new like understandings of the world and humanity. Because when we have something that's permanent, it's not moving, it's not changing. And then we run into problems in the future where we don't have the same kind of critical dialogue happening and we accept it as truth. Even though like the surrounding cultures have changed and our understanding has changed.
Got it.
hopefully that was answering your question.
Yeah, no, I think it's an open-ended question and an open-ended answer. I think everyone's opinion might be different about
Yeah.
what should or shouldn't be. I really
Mhm.
personally just really like the sort of like transparency that your monument has through the voice of the people in the space that it's monument that's been more memorializing.
And like I said, I don't think permanent monuments are bad. The Vietnam Memorial is a really great example of a sensitive and inclusive public monument that allows for participation and allows people to take ownership of their experience. But a lot of monuments don't do that. And it's really common in these permanent monuments because times change, and people change, and people who have experienced it will pass and we'll have new generations coming along. We lose a lot often when we have these stone edifices that don't um, don't really have the capacity to tell the full story.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Then Angela had a question. How has the experience of working in monuments and memorials changed your view of the world and caused you to think differently from how you were raised to think?
So I think it's made me question the source of what I hear and how it can then impact the definition of people, like how we define and categorize people. I'm reading a book right now called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and talking about how, caste, we have a caste system in the United States. So it's just kind of invisible, not really, it's just kind of not talked about, ignored. And um, it working with monuments and memorials has really made me see how we have kind of kept these caste systems alive through what we venerate and what we um, don't, and what we choose to ignore and to forget. The fact that we have monuments to Confederate soldiers that were fighting to own human beings is wild, but we've been so desensitized as a culture that it is an issue to debate instead of humanity to protect. And yeah, that so for me, it's changed how I perceive events and have now chosen to personify them to make sure that I'm understanding the humanity of the people that it whatever we make affects, because we aren't in a silo, we are part of a community, right? Local, global, whatever, like we are part of a community, and the work that we make as designers has impact beyond our immediate selves. Um, and that's really changed how I work. It's given me like a little bit of a complex, but am I worthy of doing this? Or like, am I like, but I think that's healthy because uh, it, it kind of gives you a baseline of humility in that.
Mhm. And then there are two more questions. One question I have is like, so with these like digital installations that were projected onto the wall, how are things like that archived, and could someone? I
Mhm.
mean, I know they're on the internet, but is there any physical thing that's you could give to someone, like the person that's telling the story, for them to kind of have, or yeah, just curious about that.
Well, I have not, but that sounds great. I think that's a really interesting idea of, because like there's like so much within the like psychology of this that I wasn't able to talk about because of time. But we have this thing with objects, like objects in memory. are really tied together, kind of rooting from our transitionary objects like blankets and teddy bears and things like that we had when we were children, that bring us comfort. And we see it in like a multitude of cultures as well. Like I'm Italian, and for large events we have like bomboniere that we give out, right? So these objects are like mementos or of memory of that moment. And so as humans, we see that through many different cultures and experiences. So I think that's a really interesting, I can't believe I didn't think of it, but thank you, Christian, for giving me another
Yeah.
idea of how to honor the residents and the folks who are sharing their stories.
Yeah. What comes to mind is like some sort of like family heirloom that you could pass
Mhm.
along. What that
Mhm.
is, that is something like a video projected on a wall.
Mhm.
All right.
It's a really great idea. Like,
Uh, so I know we're almost at time, but there's two more questions in the chat.
okay.
You mind if we go a little over, Lauren, and everyone
I mean,
else?
I'm cool.
Okay. All right. So another question from Melissa. As a now Boulder, Colorado resident, I've had the King Super shooting that happened over a month ago on my mind a lot. Would you be interested in pursuing monument memorial design as your main profession, or do you prefer to jump on the ones that you feel most passionate about, but not be your main career focus?
Well, way to give me like an existential crisis, Alyssa. Um, I don't know. I have so many interests. Like, how can you pick one thing? Um, I don't know. I It's also super depressing. Like this is really a hard field to be in, um, or to focus on, uh, especially if I were to like kind of narrow in on mass shootings. Um, I kind of have to be like protective of myself in that way. Like it took a lot out of me to do the NIU monument. Um, and uh, yeah, I also love teaching so much. So you're not going to get me out of that.
All right, and the last question from Brooke, she asks, what is your dream pie in the sky project?
Oh my goodness. This is going to be kind of out there, but I have been talking about it and thinking about it for a really long time. I care a lot about accessibility for like cultural institutions, and right now museums are not accessible to most people. Um, and I would love to partner with somebody like the Field Museum or something and create pop-up exhibitions in neighborhoods with their back collection. That's kind of like one of my big dreams. Is they have a ton of stuff in storage, and like lots of specimens, and we could be taking them into storefronts in neighborhoods and bringing like science and learning and natural history to people where they are at, instead of expecting them to somehow get their butts to the downtown, you know. That's my dream. It may be a reality. I'm going to work on it one day.
Awesome. Well, we ended just at time. Thank you so much, Lauren. This was great. I feel like I've learned so much as a graphic designer. Like it's nice to explore a different medium that I feel like many of us probably don't get a chance to think about. So thank you. And
Thank
yeah, thanks
you.
for everyone for participating, asking questions. This was great. Um, this talk was recorded, so it is going to be on our YouTube. So if anyone wants to rewatch or share with people, you're more than welcome to. But as always, thanks. You could follow us on social media to keep up with what's coming up. And here's Lauren's contact.
Little plug.
Cool.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. That was awesome.